He laughed over crystal glasses and called her childless in front of his rich guests, like her life was a joke meant for entertainment. She stood there in her maid's uniform, head bowed, swallowing humiliation she'd learned to survive in silence. What he didn't know was that 4 children with her blood were still alive, hidden, scattered, and stolen by the very system he controlled. And as she tightened her grip on the photo burning in her pocket, one question loomed in the air. How did a billionaire erase a black mother's children? And what happens when she finally fights back? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The snow had settled like icing on a cake, blanketing the Slate estate in pristine white, a vision that belonged in a holiday magazine, not real life. Towering evergreens shimmered under the weight of frost, their branches bending with the cold, while antique lanterns lit the stone pathway leading to the double oak doors. Inside the mansion, warmth poured from ornate fireplaces, casting shadows on oil paintings worth more than a working man's salary. But that warmth was selective. It didn't stretch to the servants' quarters, nor did it soften the tone of the man who owned it all. Lorraine Jefferson moved silently across the grand dining hall, a damp cloth in hand as she polished the silver that no one except Gregory Slate ever touched. Her fingers were stiff from hours of work, but her back remained straight, her composure flawless. Years of domestic labor had taught her the art of being invisible. She knew when to disappear, when to step forward, when to hold her tongue, but nothing prepared her for what was coming. Gregory Slate, the billionaire venture capitalist turned political darling, stood at the head of his massive dining table, surrounded by society's most powerful CEOs, judges, former governors, all white, all laughing, glasses of scotch and wine glittering in hand. The room reeked of excess, cigar smoke mingling with the scent of truffle oil and rare French cheese. Lorraine moved behind them like a shadow, unseen, unbothered, until Slate decided to notice her. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Tell me, Lorraine," he said, his voice loud enough to hush the table. "What does a woman like you do for Christmas when you have no family to spend it with?" The room paused. Forks hovered midair, then the punchline hit. "Oh wait," Slate added with a grin. "I forgot you're childless, aren't you?" Laughter erupted. Cruel, thoughtless. The kind of laughter that echoed off marble and glass and cut deeper than any blade. Some guests looked at each other awkwardly, but most chuckled, pleased to be entertained. Lorraine froze, cloth still in hand, her body stiff, her eyes refusing to meet theirs. She didn't flinch, didn't wince. She simply looked down, blinked slowly, and set the cloth neatly on the tray. Slate raised his glass toward her like he was toasting an old friend. "Cheers, dear. Don't take it personal. It's just a joke." A joke. Lorraine had heard them all. The jokes about her skin, her past, her presence. To the Slates of the world, her pain was performance, her existence entertainment. As the laughter faded and the guests returned to their wine and gossip, Lorraine backed away from the table, her steps slow, methodical. She moved down the long hallway toward the servants' quarters, her chest burning beneath her uniform. But her face remained composed. Down in the narrow corridor behind the kitchen, she finally stopped, her back to the wall. She pulled a worn envelope from her apron pocket. Inside were 4 photographs, creased at the corners, well handled and well hidden. She looked at each face, all teenagers now, each with a different background, different clothing, different lives, but all hers. Her fingers hovered over the photo of the boy with the dimple on the left cheek. He had his father's smile, and the girl with the heavy eyebrows. She had Lorraine's own stubborn chin. 17 years. 17 Christmases without them. 4 children, born in a world that didn't want them together, that had forced her hand. She had watched from afar, sometimes receiving a photo through a third party, sometimes hearing whispers through social workers who bent the rules. But she never reached out, never revealed who she was. Because back then she was told they would be better off without her. Told by people in offices with clean suits and careful voices. Told that a black woman, single and grieving, couldn't raise 4 children in a city that barely tolerated her existence. Told that her love would hurt them more than help them. So she let them go. But they weren't gone. They were out there, living, breathing, growing. And Gregory Slate had just insulted the very part of her soul that still throbbed with motherhood. Lorraine pressed the photos to her chest, fighting the surge of grief, guilt, and rage. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not on his property. She stood up straight, slid the photos back into her pocket, and returned to the dining room, composed as ever. Slate was still talking politics, already moved on to mocking protest movements, and laughing about cancel culture. He didn't even glance at her, but someone did. At the far end of the table, a woman in a silver dress, the wife of a tech mogul, tilted her head, watching Lorraine with mild curiosity. Her gaze lingered for just a moment too long before she turned back to her plate. Lorraine continued serving silently, until the final course was laid, and the champagne glasses refilled. Then she disappeared into the hallway again, heading toward the back stairs that led to the attic. Most servants never went up there, but Lorraine had found solitude among the old trunks and antique furniture. It was the one place in the house where no one demanded, no one mocked, and no one looked at her like she didn't belong. She climbed the steps slowly, each one creaking beneath her. When she reached the attic, she lit a single lamp and sat by a narrow window that overlooked the woods. Snowflakes danced across the glass. She took out the photos again, spreading them in front of her like tarot cards. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow, she would stop being invisible. Tomorrow, she would start searching. But even as resolve hardened in her chest, a sound echoed up the stairs. Footsteps. Fast. Urgent. Lorraine quickly gathered the photos and tucked them beneath the floorboard she had loosened years ago. The door creaked open. It was Jamal, the young dishwasher from Queens, who'd only been working at the estate for 3 months. He looked panicked. "Lorraine," he whispered, "you need to come down now. Someone's in the study, looking through your things." Lorraine calmly walks away, gripping a photo of 4 teenagers in her apron pocket. Lorraine did not sleep that night. Even after the mansion quieted and the last guest's laughter dissolved into the snow-covered driveway, her body remained tense, as if danger still hovered in the air. Jamal's warning echoed in her mind, but no one ever confronted her directly. Whatever had been searched, whatever had been noticed, remained unspoken. That silence was louder than any accusation. It followed her into the narrow servant's room, followed her into the thin blanket she pulled over herself, followed her into memory, where the fire still burned. 17 years earlier, the smell had come first. Smoke thick and bitter, crawling under doors and settling in the back of her throat. Lorraine had been asleep on a torn couch in a cramped apartment on the south side of Albany, her swollen belly making it impossible to find comfort. She had been 8 months pregnant, exhausted, waiting for her fiancé to return from a late shift. When her eyes opened, the ceiling above her was already dark with soot, the air too hot to breathe. She remembered trying to stand and failing, panic clawing through her chest as the first wave of pain hit her stomach. The fire alarm screamed, neighbors shouted, and somewhere in the chaos, her water broke. The timing felt cruel, almost deliberate, as if the universe had decided to test how much one woman could endure in a single night. She screamed for help, not knowing if anyone could hear her over the crackling flames. He came anyway. Marcus Hale burst through the smoke wearing his firefighter's jacket, his face streaked with ash, eyes wide with terror when he saw her on the floor. He had been off duty, but someone had recognized his truck outside and dragged him back in. He lifted her despite the heat, despite the collapsing ceiling, despite knowing the building was seconds from giving way. Lorraine remembered clinging to him, begging him not to let go, her words slurred by smoke and fear.
They never made it out together.
Marcus shoved her through a shattered window into the arms of another firefighter just as the stairwell collapsed behind him. The last thing Lorraine saw was his helmet disappearing into the smoke as he turned back toward the building, toward people still trapped inside. She passed out before she could scream his name again. She woke up in a hospital room with white walls and no windows. The fire had burned half the block. Marcus was gone. They told her he died a hero, as if that was supposed to comfort her, as if heroism replaced the future they had planned. The small wedding, the shared last name, the children they joked about naming after jazz musicians and civil rights leaders. She gave birth the next morning. 4 cries filled the room, one after another, each one slicing through her grief and anchoring her to the present. Quadruplets. The doctors looked stunned, nurses whispering about miracles and odds. Lorraine barely heard them. She stared at the tiny faces, all different, all impossibly small, all alive. For a moment she thought maybe this was the universe trying to balance the scale, taking 1 life and giving 4, but balance never came. Medical bills stacked faster than she could read them. The city praised Marcus publicly, but privately, support was thin. A one-time check, a folded flag, condolences that faded once the news cameras left. Lorraine couldn't work. Her lungs were damaged from smoke inhalation. The babies needed care she couldn't afford. Each day brought another official, another clipboard, another conversation framed as concern, but edged with judgment. They talked about stability, about resources, about realism. They never talked about love. A woman from a private agency visited her hospital room 2 weeks after the birth. She spoke softly, wore pearls, and sat just far enough away to feel professional. She talked about options, about families who could give the children everything Lorene could. She talked about sacrifice as if it were noble, as if pain became easier when dressed in the language of responsibility. Lorene resisted at first. She told them she would figure it out, that she had family, that she didn't need saving. But the visits continued. Different faces, same message. Each one reminded her of her bank balance, her health, her race, though never directly. They implied it through tone, through statistics, through phrases like, children like yours, and challenging environments. They painted a future where her kids struggled because of her, where love wasn't enough to protect them from the world. Eventually, exhaustion broke her down. She signed the papers with shaking hands, tears blurring the ink. They promised open adoption, updates, pictures. They promised the children would stay together. That promise mattered most. She clung to it like a lifeline. Then the promises disappeared. The first year, she received one letter, a photo of 4 infants wrapped in matching blankets. The second year, nothing. When she called, numbers changed, offices closed, records were sealed. She was told it was out of her hands now, that reopening wounds wouldn't help anyone. The words felt rehearsed, delivered without empathy. Lorene learned what it meant to grieve children who were still alive. Back in the present, she sat at the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the wall as dawn crept through the small window. The memory left her hollow, but also sharp, because something about that night, about the speed, the pressure, the sudden disappearance of her children from the system, never sat right. At the time, she had been too broken to question it. Now, 17 years later, working in the home of a man who treated her existence like a punchline, the unease returned with force. She went through her day mechanically, cooking, cleaning, avoiding eyes. Every sound made her tense. Every door opening felt like an accusation. She expected someone to call her name, to confront her about the attic, about the photos, about Jamal's warning, but no one did. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the mansion glowed gold against the snow, a package appeared at the servants' entrance.
No name, no return address.
Just her address written neatly in black ink. Lorene stared at it for a long time before touching it. Her hands trembled as she carried it into the laundry room, the only place with a door that locked. She sat on an upturned crate and opened it slowly, bracing herself for disappointment, for another dead end, for silence. Inside was a single envelope, and inside that envelope was a photograph. 4 teenagers stood together on a sidewalk, unaware they were being watched. One laughed openly, head thrown back. Another stared at a phone. The third leaned against a fence, arms crossed. The fourth looked straight ahead, expression guarded, familiar. They were taller now, older, changed, but unmistakable. Lorene pressed her hand over her mouth as a sound escaped her that wasn't quite a sob, and wasn't quite a laugh. Her children were real, together, alive. On the back of the photo, 3 words were written. They're closer than you think. Her breath caught, because for the first time in 17 years, the past wasn't buried anymore. It was reaching back. Lorene clutches the photo as she realizes someone has been watching her children and knows exactly who she is. The envelope sat on the laundry table like a threat wrapped in paper. It hadn't come with answers, just more questions. Questions that now took over every breath Lorene Jefferson inhaled. She held the photograph tightly, tracing each outline, memorizing the faces of her children again and again. Her mind raced as she tried to decipher how someone could have tracked all 4 of them down when she'd spent nearly 2 decades failing to do the same. Whoever sent the package not only knew who the children were but knew where to find her too. That knowledge pressed on her chest like a weight no uniform could hide. Lorene waited until the house was silent before she acted. After scrubbing dishes long past when she needed to, after folding linen with deliberate slowness, she slipped out into the icy December night, coat buttoned tight, and nerves tighter. The estate's surveillance didn't reach the far corner near the compost shed. She'd studied the blind spots. Her bus ride into Albany was long, cold, and silent. She sat hunched beneath the flickering light, clutching the envelope inside her purse like it might dissolve if she let it go. She didn't go to the police. She didn't trust systems designed to make women like her feel small. Instead, she remembered a name, Terrence Lomax, a small-time private investigator who once lived down the hall from her cousin in Queens. He had a habit of drinking too early and bragging too much, but he also had something else: records, contacts, a tendency to ask questions where no one else would. She found him in a low-rent office over a pawn shop, surrounded by files piled like towers, and a window stained with years of cigarette smoke. He squinted at her when she stepped in, took one look at her maid's uniform peeking from under the coat, and softened. "You workin' for Slate?" he asked, as if that explained everything. "I'm working to find what he stole," she answered. That got his attention. Lorraine laid the photo down carefully. Then the envelope. Terrence leaned forward, lips pressed in a thin line as he scanned the teens' faces. His eyes darted to the note scrawled on the back. "They're closer than you think." He didn't speak for a long time, just sat there, absorbing. When he finally did, it wasn't a question. "You think these are your kids?" "They are my kids," she said, steady and quiet. "And someone else knows it." He looked up sharply. "Who?" "That's what I need you to find out." Terrence didn't ask her for money, not at first. Maybe it was the fire behind her voice. Maybe it was the way her hands refused to shake even when her eyes were wet. Maybe it was because he'd seen enough women like her walk into this world's traps and vanish without a trace. He agreed to help her, but not without warning. "If someone sent this," he said, tapping the photo, "they want something. People don't give out this kind of information for free." Lorraine knew that already, but knowing didn't help her sleep. Over the next several days, she slipped between worlds, serving caviar to billionaires in the morning, then slipping away to meet Terrence at diners and parking lots, her coat zipped up to her neck, head low. He pulled adoption records, school attendance logs, social media traces. The children had grown up scattered: Nevada, Georgia, Connecticut, and upstate New York. Different last names, different stories. None of them had stayed together. "They promised they would," Lorraine whispered one evening in the back of a laundromat, staring at 4 different case files spread across a folding table. Terrence gave her a long look. "They always promise, especially to women who can't afford lawyers." The more he uncovered, the more things stopped making sense. The adoption trail was messy, too messy. Some files were redacted. Others were missing key dates. A few appeared digitally altered, as if someone had scrubbed identities clean. There were foundations involved, some of them registered under parent companies that led to offshore accounts, or nonprofits owned by men with long political reach. And one name kept reappearing, subtly, not on the documents directly, but in connections, in patterns, in funding sources. Slate Holding. It was Gregory Slate's name. Over and over, tied to child welfare programs, private foster care agencies, youth outreach grants that conveniently aligned with the years Lorraine's children had disappeared into the system. It wasn't coincidence. It was a network. Terrence's face changed the day he came across a sealed court case involving a minor unusually well-funded, fast-tracked, and closed within weeks. The adoptive family was anonymous. The signature on the funding support, a subsidiary that Slate had sold 2 years later for $8 million. "Lorraine," he said carefully, "your kids didn't just get lost in the system. They were routed through it. Intentionally. Someone made sure they vanished." It hit her like a cold slap. The fire hadn't just taken Marcus. It had triggered a machine, an invisible conveyor belt, that rolled over poor black families and spit their children into better homes. Homes that came with contracts, payoffs, and the illusion of opportunity. She sat in Terrence's office, staring at a grainy picture of one of her sons. He worked part-time at a mechanic shop in Albany, just miles away from where she now lived. The irony burned. She'd spent 17 years in exile, while her blood had grown up right around the corner. "He's so close," she whispered. "So close, and I didn't even know." Terrence nodded slowly. It was meant to happen that way. On the 5th night of their digging, he asked her the question she'd been dreading. "Are you ready to meet them?" She paused. Her heart screamed yes, but her fear whispered louder. What if they hated her? What if they believed what the world had told them, that she gave them away willingly, that she chose absence? "I don't know," she admitted. Terrence didn't pressure her. He simply nodded and slipped a flash drive into her hand. Just in case. That night, Lorraine returned to the mansion later than usual, her eyes hollow, her steps slow. Gregory Slate passed her in the hallway, chatting on the phone with someone in Congress, laughing about immigration nonsense and urban decay. He didn't even notice her. But someone else did. The woman in the silver dress, the same one from the Christmas dinner table, appeared again, this time on the staircase. Her eyes met Lorraine's. She gave a nod, small, subtle, as if she knew something, as if she were waiting for something. Lorraine didn't stop walking. Later, curled up on her cot, she stared at the ceiling, thinking of Marcus, thinking of fire, thinking of babies who now drove cars and voted, and had names she hadn't given them. At 1:47 a.m. her phone rang, a blocked number. She answered, heart pounding. Lorraine, Terrence's voice came through the static, urgent and low. I found something. You need to listen carefully. What is it? She whispered. They're not safe. His voice cracked. All four of them. Someone's watching them too. The PI calls her late at night. Lorraine, they're not safe. Lorraine didn't sleep after Terrence's call. The words "they're not safe" ran through her veins like a slow poison, infecting every thought, every motion. She stayed curled beneath the thin blanket on her cot in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling as if the cracked plaster could offer her clarity. Outside, the estate braced for the largest holiday gala of the season, but inside Lorraine's chest, something colder than winter settled in. Her babies were being watched, and she still didn't know by who. The next morning, Slate's mansion buzzed with orchestrated chaos. Florists wheeled in arrangements that dwarfed most people. Crystal centerpieces were unpacked with gloves, and temporary staff arrived by the vanload. Slate wanted the event to be perfect, not just for appearances, but because high-profile donors were flying in. The gala was being pitched as a fundraiser for urban youth development. Lorraine could barely stomach the irony. She moved silently between the preparations, setting out wine glasses that cost more than her month's salary, and ironing tablecloths, imported from France. Her fingers worked, but her mind was fixed on one thing. Terrence had promised to deliver hard evidence, something she could hold in her hand, and tonight, during this so-called charitable celebration, she intended to get answers. By midday, she received a text, behind panel in study. Top drawer. You'll know it when you see it. It came from an encrypted number Terrence had taught her to use. That was all. No greeting, no warning, but she didn't need more. The study was Slate's sacred ground, off limits to staff, unless summoned. It reeked of cigar smoke, leather and control. The heavy mahogany door stayed locked, but Lorraine had learned that the second-floor housekeeping cart carried a master key taped beneath the wheel. She timed her moment, waiting until the house manager was arguing with the caterers over foie gras presentation. She slipped inside the study like a ghost. The room was dark, oak-paneled, oppressive. A massive globe stood in the corner, outdated and marked with red pins and places Lorraine had never heard of. The desk was absurd, oversized, and filled with self-importance, topped with a bust of some European philosopher and a single fountain pen. But her eyes went to the drawer immediately. Top right. Just like the message said, she pulled it open slowly. Inside, regular files, tax records, land titles, donation receipts. Nothing screamed conspiracy. She was about to close it when her fingers brushed the paneling along the back. Something shifted. A click. There it was. A false panel slid back, revealing a hidden compartment lined with charcoal-colored folders. Each was labeled with a different set of initials and numbers. Her breath caught. She yanked them out, heart pounding. The names were abbreviated, but dates jumped out, years spanning from 2003 to 2012. She froze when she saw a familiar sequence, JH 2006. Another RID, BH 2006. A chill crept up her spine. With shaking hands, she flipped open the folder marked BH. There, tucked between notarized forms and agency documents, was a black and white photograph of a toddler, with chubby cheeks and a distant look in his eyes. His name had been redacted, but Lorraine didn't need it. She knew that face. She turned to the next page and saw a stamp in red ink, property of Children's Futures Initiative, managed by SH Holdings. She stared at it, confused. Share H. Holdings? Her mind turned slowly, grinding through what she remembered. That wasn't Gregory Slate's company. Or was? She set the folder down, went to the bookshelf, and reached for the corporate awards lined up like trophies. She lifted one with Slate's name engraved, and beneath it was the full title, Slate Hanley Holdings. Her fingers went cold. It was his company, just split under a different title, a shell name used for foundations, probably to create distance from his public empire. She looked back at the folders. The implications were screaming now. Children had been filtered through this, paperwork rewritten, identity swapped, birth records sealed under this fake non-profit structure. This wasn't just an adoption mishap. This was a pipeline, a system. Her children weren't exceptions, they were inventory. Suddenly the file she held felt radioactive. Lorene flipped through the other folders. Names she didn't know. Children she'd never seen. But all bearing the same structure. The same network of forged paths. Some had placements listed in rural towns across the country. Others had been adopted internationally. She felt sick, and somewhere between the pages, one document changed everything. A contract. It was written in clean, formal language. An agreement between the Children's Futures Initiative and a private firm named Northbridge Family Resources. The signature at the bottom made her go still. Gregory T. Slate. It was dated March 2006. Just 3 months after Marcus died. 3 months after she gave birth. Her entire world narrowed into one sharp, shattering realization. Slate didn't just insult her with cruelty that night at the dinner table. He owned the system that erased her children from her life. Her hand gripped the folder so tightly the edge cut her palm. She didn't feel it. Rage moved through her not in shouts but in silence. It was the kind of fury that buried itself in bone. She scanned the room quickly. Cameras, microphones. Her instincts told her this room was meant to intimidate, not record. She stuffed 3 folders beneath her coat, folding them to fit. Just as she reached for the 4th, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Panic hit her throat. The handle turned. She barely had time to slide the drawer shut, smooth the cloth on the desk, and duck behind the heavy curtain near the fireplace. She held her breath. The door creaked open. Voices. Slate and another man entered, laughing. She could smell the whiskey on their breath from across the room. They were discussing tonight's gala, who was attending, how much they were expected to donate, and which speeches Slate wanted televised. Urban investment, Greg. The man said. That's your gold ticket. Talk about kids. Talk about opportunity. Don't mention the actual neighborhoods. Gregory chuckled. Please, I invented that script. Make them feel guilty. Offer a photo op. And get the check. They want to believe we care. Lorene's nails dug into the curtain. Her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. She couldn't cry, couldn't make a sound. She had to survive this room. Then the man added casually, You ever think about those kids from the fire? Slate paused. Which ones? The firefighter's girlfriend. The ones you rerouted through Hanley's agency back in '06. What happened with them? A slow silence filled the room. Slate's voice dropped lower. They were placed. All 4. Separate states. Clean breaks. No loose ends. Think she knows? She doesn't even know her own worth. Slate replied with a smug chuckle. You saw her. Still wiping glasses like her bloodline means nothing. Their laughter followed them out the door. Lorene stayed frozen, breath shallow, until the hallway was silent again. Then she slipped from behind the curtain and stumbled out through the servants' exit. She made it back to the kitchen and locked herself in the pantry, where no one would hear her shaking. She pulled out the folder again. At the bottom, in fine print, were the adoption seals, names, case numbers, and one more line, almost hidden, finalized under court recommendation by Judge P. Hanley, 4th Circuit Family Court, Hanley, Slate Hanley Holdings. Her children hadn't been just removed, they'd been brokered. Lorene finds Slate's name on her children's sealed adoption records. The walls of the pantry felt too close. Lorene couldn't breathe. Not from panic. No, that came later. What clenched her lungs now was the realization that every corner of her life had been boxed and sold under the name of a man she served coffee to every morning. The man who insulted her, who joked about her childlessness, had orchestrated the very theft of her children, like he was collecting antiques and erasing their stories. It wasn't random. It wasn't bureaucratic mess. It was intentional. Engineered. She stared at the signature at the bottom of the adoption contract. Gregory T. Slate. Her fingers, still stained with cleaning fluid, hovered over the line as if touching it would burn her. There were no tears left. Not right now. Just the icy weight of purpose. Because now it wasn't just about reunion. It was about truth, about exposing something bigger than her. And to do that, she'd need proof that no paper trail could erase. That night, while Slate was upstairs prepping his closing speech for the gala, likely rehearsing his rehearsed empathy, in front of a gold-framed mirror, Lorene slipped into the upstairs hallway with practiced ease. No one noticed the maid anymore. She moved like furniture. She had cleaned this house for nearly 2 years. She knew the staff rotation. She She knew Slate's bedroom door didn't fully latch unless pulled twice. She knew the cleaners left the bathroom toothbrushes in the wrong holder every Thursday. She entered the master bathroom with surgical calm. She didn't take his comb, too many loose hairs. Too inconsistent. She didn't trust his hand towels laundered too often. But the toothbrush, that was direct, intimate. Brushed with DNA every morning. She picked it up gently with gloved fingers, wrapped it in a sandwich bag she'd stashed inside her apron, and slid it into her coat pocket. The entire move took less than 20 seconds. Back in her quarters, she texted Terrence using the burner number. Got it. Need match. He didn't respond for hours. Lorene barely blinked. When the message came through, it was direct. Mail it. Prepaid box en route. Don't speak to anyone until I confirm results. Days passed in a blur of smiling at guests and choking on shame. She cleaned Slate's champagne spills and ironed his shirts, all while knowing she carried a secret that could crack his pristine legacy in half. She hadn't told Terrence what she suspected, not fully. She wasn't ready to say it out loud, but it was there, lurking beneath everything she knew. A gnawing, impossible thought, because when she had looked at the photo of her youngest son, Brian, something had struck her. Not just the eyes or the crooked smile, but the chin. That sharp, jutting chin she didn't recognize. That wasn't Marcus's. She had dismissed it before, convinced herself it was a fluke of genes, or coincidence. But now, holding proof of Slate's involvement in their placements, her mind wouldn't stop turning. What if one of her children wasn't just stolen? What if one of them was his? The package arrived at the estate 3 days later, tucked into the staff mailbox without fanfare. It was light, barely noticeable. Inside was a slim manila envelope, labeled simply confidential, match report. Lorene didn't open it in the house. She waited until her shift ended, then walked 3 blocks down to a quiet park near the old train station. The benches were worn, but the trees blocked most of the wind. She sat down, hands trembling, and unfolded the report. There it was. Clear. Undeniable. DNA match. 99.98%. Parental probability. Subject G.T. Slate. Matched with Brian J. Harris. She read it again. Then again. The world didn't spin. It stopped. Time stilled around her. Cars blurred past. A mother yelled after her toddler in the distance. Somewhere a dog barked. But inside Lorene, everything dropped into silence. Slate wasn't just the architect of the separation. He was the blood. Her stomach churned. She closed the envelope slowly, her breath catching in her throat. She felt like she'd swallowed glass. Brian. Her Brian wasn't Marcus's child. He was Gregory Slate's. The twist of it all made her dizzy. Slate, who had mocked her to his elite dinner guests. Slate, who signed the adoption records as if they were business contracts. Slate, who had seen her serving in his home for 2 years without flinching. He was the biological father of one of the very children he'd helped erase from her life. How? When? Her mind scrambled through every memory. She and Marcus had been on and off for months before the fire. There had been a single night, a moment of collapse when she was desperate for work, after being fired from a cleaning agency. A charity gala. A back room. A powerful man who promised her a job if she cleaned up after an after-hours event. She had gone. She had cleaned. She remembered Slate being there. Vague flirtation. A drink she barely touched. A memory that always felt fogged. Had it happened? Was Brian born from that night? Was that why Slate took him? Suddenly it all made sense. Slate hadn't just participated in the adoption agency to shuffle unwanted children into better lives. He had engineered the system to make his mistakes disappear. Brian wasn't placed out of charity. He was placed to vanish, buried in bureaucracy, erased from lineage, removed from inheritance. And she had been the loose thread he never expected to see again. Lorene's hands balled into fists on her lap. Her mind raced not just with anger, but strategy. She had to be careful now. She couldn't confront Slate. Not yet. Not while he held power. Not while she had no legal footing, no media attention, no allies. She needed to find Brian. All of them. She needed them together. But Brian most of all. Because now this wasn't just about reunion. It was about protection. If someone else found out who he was before she reached him. Her phone buzzed. A text from Terrence. We need to talk. Someone else has been pulling files on the kids. I wasn't the only one looking. Lorene replied instantly. Who? His response chilled her to the bone. No name, but they accessed court records using a judge's login. Someone inside. The system was still watching, still guarding Slate's secrets. And now that she had the match report, she was a threat. Not just a grieving mother, but a liability. She folded the envelope and stuffed it deep into her coat lining. No more waiting. No more hesitating. She was going to bring them together. And she was going to burn Slate's empire to the ground. The lab confirms one of her sons is biologically related to Slate. Lorene didn't return to the estate that night. She couldn't. Her body moved, but her soul was fractured in places she didn't even know existed. The DNA report burned inside her coat like it carried fire, its revelation carving a new wound into a life already scored by loss. Brian, her youngest, was Gregory Slate's son. Not Marcus's, not hers alone. His bloodline, that cold billionaire's, now ran through the veins of a boy who had never known what power was stolen from him. She wandered the edge of the Hudson River, letting the icy wind sting her skin like punishment for not seeing the truth sooner. She replayed everything. The night she worked that charity gala, the blurry hours, the vague flirtation. Slate passed off as charm. Had he drugged her? Used her? She had never questioned it, too distracted by the chaos that followed. But now the timeline made cruel sense. Brian had always been different. Not in love, not in presence, but in detail. The pieces fell into place like shattered glass rearranging into a mirror she didn't want to look into. Terrence met her outside a closed community center at sunrise. His car idled in the cold, the windows fogged over, his face shadowed with concern. "You look like you saw a ghost," he said as she slid into the passenger seat, her fingers clutching the report like a lifeline. "I did," she whispered. "And he's alive, living in a house that I cleaned for scraps." Terrence didn't ask what she meant. He simply reached for the folder. When he read the result, his face went still. No smirk, no clever remark, no cynical laugh, just silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. "Slate's the father?" he asked, finally. "Of Brian," she replied, and he knew. Terrence turned his eyes to the windshield, the frost painting slow patterns over the glass. "That explains everything," he said. "Why Brian's adoption record was cleaner than the others. Why it was funded directly through that shell agency. He wanted to erase him, wipe him off the map before anyone found out." Lorene's voice cracked. "He placed his own child like merchandise. He never looked back. Rich men don't erase mistakes. They bury them in systems they control." It was more than that, though. Lorene felt it. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was a theft of lineage, of identity, of legacy, and it had a specific cruelty reserved for women like her. Slate had taken everything, her love, her labor, her child, and reshaped the narrative so that even his own shame wore privilege like armor. She leaned back in the seat, staring at the gray sky. "How do I even tell Brian? How do I tell the others that he's not their full brother? That the man who destroyed their lives shares blood with one of them?" Terrence said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "You tell them the truth. All of it. Before someone else does." And that was the fear. Someone else already knew. The warning in Terrence's last message, the one about a judge's logging used to access sealed court files, was no idle paranoia. Someone inside the system had been keeping track, watching. Slate had strings in places that couldn't be seen, and Lorene's every move was now a step through a field of tripwires. That night she returned to the estate wearing a mask of calm so convincing it scared her. She prepared dinner for guests, scrubbed granite counters, and smiled at Mrs. Alcott's casual comments about people from the inner city. No one suspected that the maid serving dessert had evidence that could detonate the empire they drank wine under. But something had shifted. Slate watched her now. Not obviously, not with direct glances. But she felt it in the way he paused when she walked past, in the questions he asked the staff about who'd been in his office, in the small probing comments he dropped like pebbles into still water. "You seem quieter lately, Lorene," he said once, swirling a glass of bourbon. "Everything okay?" She nodded. "Just focused, sir." "Focused is good," he said, smiling too thin. "I like people who stay in their lane." She swallowed the bile in her throat, and nodded. The next day, Terrence brought another file. One Lorene hadn't expected. "This was hard to pull," he said, sliding it across the cafe table. "Slate's sealed business audits. There's one from 10 years ago you'll want to see." She flipped through the pages, and her heart dropped. A quiet payout. Large. Unexplained. Dated just 2 months after Brian's birth. The recipient? A medical clinic in Brooklyn that specialized in private paternity testing. Slate had tested Brian back then. He had confirmed paternity himself, which meant not only did he know Brian was his, he made sure, and then, instead of claiming him, instead of offering even basic acknowledgement, he erased him, relegated him to a file, an invoice, a whisper. Lorene felt sick. He took him, she whispered, like he was nothing, like he didn't matter. Terrence leaned forward. Lorene, this isn't just about you anymore. If he's done this once, he's done it before. There may be other women, other kids. The thought was paralyzing, but it made sense. Men like Slate didn't make one mistake. They built systems around their appetites and called them business. I need to see Brian, she said. Terrence nodded. I've found him. He's working at a private boarding school 3 hours north. Maintenance crew. He uses the name Brian Jennings now. But it's him. Lorene felt her breath catch. Does he know anything? She asked. Terrence shook his head. He knows he was adopted. That's it. He doesn't know about you. Or Slate. But he's been asking questions lately. Looking into old records. Someone might have warned him. Warned him? She asked. Terrence looked uneasy. He's been followed, Lorene. Just like you. Her stomach twisted. That night, she stayed late at the estate to clean the library. Volunteered for the shift so she could slip into Slate's digital files one more time. She needed something stronger than DNA. Something legal. Something public. Something that would leave Slate with nowhere to hide. She accessed the internal server through the tablet. Slate left on the desk. He didn't bother locking it. Rich men always assumed their arrogance would protect them. The folders were layered, coded in vague titles like Community Outreach and HR MISC. She dug deeper until she found a video file labeled simply Hanley 2007. Deposition. Her heart stopped. She clicked. The screen lit up with footage of a man she recognized. Judge P. Hanley, the same name from the adoption seals. He was younger then, nervous. In a dimly lit room, he answered questions from off-screen. Did Mr. Slate instruct you to fast-track the Harris case? Yes, Hanley answered. He said it needed to be resolved quickly. Quietly. For the child's sake. And did you know he was the biological father at the time? Hanley hesitated. I suspected. But I didn't ask. He made it clear this was a private matter. Was compensation involved? Hanley looked down. I was promised a position on the board of one of his nonprofits. Lorene's hand flew to her mouth. This wasn't just evidence. This was a confession. She copied the file onto a USB drive hidden inside her boot. Her legs shook as she stood. Her heart thudded against her ribs, like it wanted out. Outside the door, Slate's voice echoed down the hallway. He was coming. Lorene hides the USB, just as Slate enters the library, and locks the door behind him. Lorene stared out the cracked window of the Harlem Cafe, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted the white ceramic sugar jar on the table for the 5th time in 2 minutes. The small corner diner had the feel of something untouched by time. Checkered floor tiles dulled by years of foot traffic, a jukebox that hadn't worked in decades, and the scent of old coffee mingling with faint grease from a forgotten breakfast. It was the kind of place no one looked twice at. That's exactly why she chose it. This was where everything was supposed to change. She had arranged it carefully, down to the last second. Terrence had made contact with each of them, her children, quiet, cautious, and discreet. He hadn't revealed everything, only that someone who cared about them deeply wanted to meet. He set different routes, provided rides, and staggered their arrivals, so as not to spook them. Lorene sat in the booth closest to the back, wearing a faded olive coat and a head wrap that shadowed her eyes. Her nerves buzzed under her skin like exposed wires. She had practiced 100 versions of what to say. None of them felt right. Because how do you look your own children in the face after 17 years of silence? Then the door creaked. First came Jaden. He walked in with shoulders squared and eyes scanning the cafe like a soldier, entering enemy territory. He was tall, taller than she remembered from the photo, and wore a thick hoodie and military-style boots. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. But when his gaze landed on her, something flickered. He stopped cold. His lips parted slightly, then pressed back together. He didn't sit right away, just stood there. Jaden, she said softly. Her voice cracked on the second syllable. He blinked slowly, and then wordlessly took the seat across from her. Before she could even reach for his hand, the bell rang again. This time, it was Renee. Lorene knew her from the eyes. Marcus's eyes, deep and full of questions. She wore headphones around her neck, and carried a chipped phone case gripped like a shield. She paused in the doorway, staring at the woman in the booth. Then at Jaden. She looked confused, guarded. You, the one who wanted to meet? She asked, her voice skeptical. Lorene nodded, lips trembling. Yes, but she didn't get to finish. Renee sat slowly, scanning both of them, then looked out the window as if ready to bolt if needed. You better start talking, she said, her voice harder than her frame. The tension was already thick, but it doubled when the third walked in. Noelle, the youngest of the girls, her fashion was sharp, deliberate, dyed hair, dramatic eyeliner, and a stiff posture that screamed both defiance and defense. She took one look at Lorene and shook her head. No, she said aloud. You gotta be kidding me. Noelle, please. You sent that man to us, she snapped, standing halfway between the table and the door. Told him to say someone who loved us wanted to meet. You left us. I don't care what you have to say. Jaden shifted, his voice calm but firm. Let her speak. Renee folded her arms. For what? So she can pretend she didn't walk away? I didn't walk away, Lorene whispered, the words trembling. I was pushed. I was told you'd be taken if I didn't sign, that you'd be split anyway, that I had no chance. Yeah? Renee cut in. You could have fought. I was 17. Homeless. Grieving. You think they gave me options? You think any of them cared what a black woman with no job and 4 infants wanted? The words sliced through the air, like a blade. Silence followed. Awkward and suffocating. Noelle lowered herself into the seat slowly, still guarded.
Where's the fourth?
Jaden asked, after a long pause. You brought us here. He's not coming. That's when the hope in Lorene's chest cracked open. She shook her head. I don't know where Brian is. She admitted. He was coming. Terrence said he confirmed. But he's not answering. Noelle frowned. He texted me 2 days ago. Said he was ready to find out the truth. Renee's voice went low. What if something happened to him? Lorene's fingers tightened on her coat. That's what I'm afraid of. They all looked at one another. For the first time, the shared confusion softened the jagged edges between them. Even Renee's glare dimmed, replaced with something that resembled worry. Jaden reached into his jacket and pulled out a flip phone, old, cracked, and barely functional. Brian sent me this last night, he muttered. It's a weird message. Just a pin drop, and the word watch. Nothing else. Lorene leaned forward. Can I see it? He passed the phone. She stared at the map. The location was a facility upstate, a private building listed under a foundation's name she instantly recognized. One slate used to fund reform schools and juvenile detention partnerships. Her throat tightened. He's in danger. We have to go get him. Noelle leaned in. Wait, what is this? What do you know? Lorene hesitated. She had tried to pace herself, tried to let them process in pieces, but she saw it now. There was no time. Because Brian isn't just your brother, she said, her voice barely audible. He's Slate's son. They stared at her, stunned. Renee blinked slowly. You're saying the billionaire? The one who runs those education programs? Lorene nodded. He's Brian's father, she said. Biologically, I have the test. He knew. He had him taken. Buried the records. I only found out recently. Jaden stood up, fists clenched. What the hell does that even mean? That we're not really siblings? You are siblings, Lorene said quickly. You shared everything. Grew up with nothing. That bond, no DNA can erase it. Noelle exhaled hard, staring at the ceiling, like she was trying not to scream. So we were experiments. Slate played God and dumped us where he felt like, and now one of us is missing, Renee said coldly. Because of him. Before anyone could respond, the cafe door burst open. 4 officers entered, weapons holstered but hands twitching. The lead one, a white sergeant with a clipped mustache and zero expression, spoke first. Lorene Jefferson, he said. She rose slowly. Her children stood too, instinctively surrounding her. You're under arrest, the officer continued, reading from a folded document. Charges include interference with legal custody, identity fraud, and suspected abduction of minors. Renee blinked. What? Jaden's voice rose. You can't be serious. The officer didn't flinch. Stand back. Noelle stepped forward. You don't get to take her. But another officer grabbed her arm and pushed her back. Jaden shouted. Renee protested. Chaos erupted as patrons stood in confusion. Phones came out, and the officers moved in on Lorene. She didn't resist. She raised her hands slowly, looked each of her children in the eyes, deep, unwavering, and said, "Don't let them separate you again. Find Brian." Then the cuffs clicked. Officers arrest Lorraine for kidnapping her own children. The holding cell smelled like disinfectant and old despair. Lorraine sat on a steel bench bolted to the wall, wrists aching where the cuffs had been tightened just a second longer than necessary. The clang of the door still rang in her ears, echoing with the kind of finality she had learned to recognize. The sound systems made when they decided who mattered and who didn't. Christmas Eve crept closer by the minute, but the fluorescent lights above her hummed with indifference, washing the room in a sickly white that flattened every human detail into something procedural and cold. An officer paced outside the bars, boots tapping like punctuation marks. "You know," he said without looking at her, "it's always the ones who look calm that are the most dangerous." He glanced over then, eyes sliding across her face as if searching for proof of something he'd already decided. "4 kids, huh? That's what you're claiming." Lorraine lifted her head. "They're not a claim. They're my children," he snorted. "That what you tell yourself?" She didn't answer. Experience had taught her the futility of explaining truth to people who weren't listening. The officer moved on, shaking his head, muttering something about attention-seeking, and another holiday mess. When she asked for a phone call, a different officer laughed outright, the sound sharp and mocking. "Phone call?" the woman said, flipping through a clipboard. "You're listed as a potential threat. That means no calls until intake clears you." "A threat to who?" Lorraine asked quietly. The woman shrugged. "To order, to custody arrangements, to common sense." They took her shoelaces, her belt, her dignity in small, efficient steps. Someone fingerprinted her with an impatience that bordered on anger, as if Lorraine's very presence was an inconvenience. When she asked again to contact a lawyer, a supervisor leaned in close enough that she could smell peppermint gum on his breath. "You're a domestic worker who tried to abduct minors on Christmas Eve," he said softly, the way men did when they wanted to sound reasonable while saying something cruel. "You're lucky we're not throwing the book at you." The book, she thought, had already been written long before today. Hours passed without markers. No window, no clock, just the distant echo of doors and the occasional burst of laughter from the desk outside. Lorraine replayed the cafe scene again and again, the shock on her children's faces, the way Jaden had stepped forward, the tremor in Renee's voice when the cuffs went on. She clung to their eyes in her memory, to the certainty that they had seen her, really seen her, if only for a moment. That would have to be enough to survive the night. In another room, a television flickered. She could hear the cadence of a news anchor through the wall, the practiced urgency of breaking coverage. Her name floated through the static like a distortion. She pressed her ear closer. "Sources say the woman, a maid employed by philanthropist Gregory Slate, has a history of erratic behavior." The anchor's voice was smooth, assured. "Officials confirm the children involved are not legally hers." Lorraine closed her eyes. The narrative took shape quickly, as it always did. A black woman, a domestic worker, obsession framed as instability, motherhood questioned, then denied. On the screen she couldn't see, photos of Slate's estate would be paired with language like tragic misunderstanding and mentally unwell. The machine moved fast when it needed to protect wealth. A guard stopped outside her cell and turned the volume up, just enough to sting. Gregory Slate appeared on screen, voice measured, expression sorrowful. "I'm deeply disturbed by these allegations," he said. "I barely know the woman. She's shown signs of emotional distress for months. I hope she gets the help she needs." The word disturbed landed like a verdict. Lorraine felt something shift inside her. Not rage, not grief, but a sharper resolve. Slate wasn't just distancing himself. He was pathologizing her, turning her pain into proof of guilt, turning her love into evidence of danger. It was a familiar tactic, one she'd seen used on women like her entire life. She breathed through it, steady and slow, refusing to give the walls the satisfaction of her breaking. When the cell door opened again, it was to move her down a corridor that smelled like old paper and coffee, into a smaller room with a bench and a camera in the corner. An officer read charges aloud, each word flattening the truth further. Interference with custody, identity fraud, potential flight risk. The last one almost made her laugh. "Do you understand the charges?" he asked. "I understand the story you're telling," she replied. "I also understand it's not the truth." He didn't look up from the form. "That's for the court to decide." She was returned to the cell with a thin blanket that did nothing to cut the cold. Somewhere, midnight passed. Christmas Eve became Christmas Day, without ceremony. Lorraine sat with her back against the wall, arms wrapped around herself, and prayed not for release, but for Brian. Wherever he was, whatever room held him, she prayed that he felt less alone than she did. Near dawn, a different officer approached the bars. She was black, maybe mid-30s, with tired eyes and a badge that caught the light when she leaned forward. She studied Lorene for a long moment, not unkindly. "Stand up," she said. Lorene obeyed. The officer reached through the bars to check the cuffs, then paused. Her hand lingered, fingers brushing Lorene's wrist in a way that felt intentional. When she withdrew, something white fluttered to the floor between Lorene's feet. "Careful," the officer said flatly, turning away. "You dropped something." Lorene waited until the footsteps faded. Then she bent slowly, heart pounding, and picked up the scrap of paper. It was folded tight, edges rough, as if torn from a larger page. She opened it with shaking hands. 3 lines, written in block letters. "I worked family court. I saw the files disappear. I know what they did." Lorene pressed the note to her chest, breath hitching. The walls didn't feel as close anymore. The night hadn't swallowed her whole after all. Somewhere inside this building, inside this system, was someone who knew the truth and was brave enough to say it. She looked up at the camera in the corner, then down at the note again, committing every letter to memory. For the first time since the cuffs clicked shut, Lorene allowed herself a small, dangerous hope. A female officer secretly passes Lorene a note. "I know what they did." Lorene read the note again in the early morning silence, her hands barely steady, heart beating in the hollow between fear and resolve. The paper felt weightless, but what it carried threatened to change everything. "I worked family court. I saw the files disappear. I know what they did." The officer returned just before shift change. Same uniform, same neutral face, but this time she walked slower, more deliberate. She stopped by Lorene's cell, eyes darting to make sure they were alone, then pulled out a clipboard and pretended to take notes. "My name's Marla Banks. I was a court clerk before I joined the department," she murmured. 10 years ago, my cousin worked for one of Slate's youth charities. She started asking questions about kids disappearing, files being sealed without due process. She vanished 6 weeks later. She was 19, Marla continued. Never had a record, never ran away before. But no one investigated. Slate donated to the mayor's campaign that same year. Everything got buried. I joined the force to find out what happened. But people like Slate, they don't leave trails unless they're ready to burn them. Lorene met her gaze. "Why now?" "Because I saw what they did to you," Marla said. "Same playbook. Strip your credibility. Frame your motherhood as madness. Make you disappear quietly while they call it justice." Marla's jaw tightened as she pulled a small folder from her coat. "I printed this from a court terminal 3 weeks ago. Thought I was crazy when I first saw your name pop up, connected to a sealed adoption case I remembered from years ago. I don't forget faces." And Slate's signature. It was all over the funding channel, hidden behind shell foundations and reform initiatives. "It's a laundering scheme, Miss Jefferson, but not for money." Lorene's eyes narrowed. "What then?" "For children." The words sat heavy between them. Marla leaned closer. "It's an underground network, protected by bureaucratic camouflage. They use nonprofits to reroute adoptions, targeting vulnerable women. They wipe records, move kids across state lines under different names, and Slate's foundations are right at the center." Lorene's voice trembled. "I need to find my son. Brian. He's in danger." Marla hesitated, then nodded once. "I'll get you out of here. But we'll have to use a loophole." She didn't wait for agreement. Within an hour, Lorene was being transferred under a procedural hold, tied to improper booking codes. Something only someone with Marla's badge access could manipulate without raising flags. No lawyer, no press, no officers trailing her. Just a nondescript sedan, waiting behind the precinct under the pretense of a temporary reassignment. Inside the car, Lorene sat in silence for a long time. Then slowly, "I had 4 children. Quadruplets. Brian. He was different. Always quiet. Always asking why. He was only a baby when they took him." Marla drove without speaking, eyes scanning the road like a soldier behind enemy lines. The city passed in gray smears through the windows. When they reached a safe house, an apartment Marla used for informants, they didn't turn on the lights. She closed the blinds, locked the door, and laid out documents across a rickety kitchen table. "The adoption laundering network is run through 4 core nonprofits," Marla explained, "all linked back to Slate's umbrella company through dummy executives. What they do is find women in crisis, single, black, under-resourced, and funnel their children through private placements that skip court oversight. They claim it's for the children's best interest, but it's all about control. She pointed to a document marked Northbridge Youth Initiative, the same name Lorraine remembered from Brian's placement papers. Every placement they arrange is under the radar, Marla continued. No proper checks. The kids are often placed with donors, or with families in debt to these foundations. Some end up in religious boarding schools. Others vanish entirely. Lorraine clenched her fists. They sold them. Like products. Marla didn't deny it. And Brian's the one Slate couldn't afford to let live freely. You were dangerous enough. But him? He's blood. Lorraine's voice was barely a whisper. So where is he? Marla reached for a laptop and pulled up a satellite image. 2 days ago, I flagged a school registered under a reform program. Slate funds called Southwell Academy. On paper, it's a private behavioral academy for at-risk youth. But its funding pattern matches 3 of the adoption cases I looked into last year. She zoomed in. The facility was remote, surrounded by woods, in a county that had only 1 registered juvenile court. There were fences, guard stations, but no school buses, no parent reviews, no press coverage. I think he's there, Marla said. I think that's where Slate keeps the ones who might talk. Lorraine stared at the image, her breath catching. That's where we go. Marla didn't argue. She just nodded. Then her face changed. She opened another folder, slower this time, more cautious. There's something else you need to see. She laid out 2 photos. One was of Brian, at 16, working maintenance at a foster home placement center. The other was of him again, months later, bruised, thinner, standing at the Southwell Academy gate. Lorraine's voice cracked. He looks scared. Because he is, Marla said. He tried to contact someone. It triggered an internal flag. Slate's team intercepted the message, and Brian was relocated within 24. How do you know that? Lorraine asked. Marla hesitated. Because he wasn't the first one. There was another boy, Andre Ellis. He aged out last year, filed a complaint with the state, said he was kept in a reform school without charges, without a parent's consent. The case was buried. Where is he now? Marla looked away. Dead. Found in the East River. Ruled a suicide. No investigation. The silence that followed was brutal. Lorraine stood slowly, walking to the window even though the blinds were drawn. This isn't just about my children anymore. No, Marla said. It's about every child Slate's empire swallowed, and the people he destroyed to keep them quiet. A phone buzzed. Marla checked the message and her face hardened. It's from a whistleblower inside the academy, she said. He confirmed Brian's there, but not for long. They're transferring him tomorrow night. Location unknown. Then we go now, Lorraine said, voice iron. Marla met her gaze and nodded. They trace Brian's location to a private reform academy funded by Slate's foundation. The Southwell Academy looked nothing like a school, tucked deep into the tree-covered hills of rural New York. It stood like a repurposed asylum, all gray concrete, barbed wire, and narrow windows that caught no light. There were no playgrounds, no banners, no sound of children playing, just silence and surveillance, the kind of place built to make you forget who you were. Marla and Lorraine arrived just after 10:00 a.m., dressed in stiff state-issued blazers, with clipped ID badges. Marla had printed using a hacked government template, and just enough insider clearance to avoid suspicion for a day. They posed as compliance auditors from the Office of Juvenile Reform, a division most small counties rarely questioned. Bureaucracy, after all, was the perfect camouflage. At the gate, a stern-faced guard flipped through their paperwork lazily, barely glancing at their IDs before waving them through. You're not on the schedule, he said flatly. Marla didn't flinch. That's the point. Random inspections. Judge Hanley's order. That name worked like a key. The gate buzzed open. Inside, the air was thick with chemical cleaning agents, and something less tangible. Fear. Young boys in matching gray uniforms moved like ghosts down tiled hallways, their eyes downcast, expressions empty. No laughter, no curiosity, only obedience. Lorraine's heart twisted. She hadn't known what to expect, but it wasn't this. They were led by a staff member in a tight bun and unblinking stare. You'll find our facility is compliant, she said in clipped tones. Most of our boys come from severe trauma backgrounds. This structure is for their own good. Marla offered a nod. We'll start with medical records. Then dormitories. The staffer hesitated. That's restricted. I wasn't asking. Marla cut in. They moved quickly, covering ground with sharp eyes and silent observations. In the infirmary, rows of medication boxes lined the shelves. Antipsychotics, sedatives, mood stabilizers. More than one had missing labels. Lorraine watched a boy no older than 13 get handed a pill cup and a plastic cup of water by a nurse who didn't look him in the eye. Do you know what this is? Lorraine asked softly. The boy shrugged. I take it when I cry too much. In the dormitories, it was worse. Rows of metal bunk beds. No personal items. No photographs. Sheets were military tucked. Uniforms folded with precision. A laminated rule sheet was nailed to the wall above every bed. Infractions in bold red font. One included emotional outbursts. Another speaking without permission. Lorraine stopped at a bed, with a torn corner on the blanket. Underneath it, carved into the wood, was a single word scratched over and over. Help. Her breath caught. Where's solitary confinement? She asked the staffer, who suddenly looked less confident. I told you. That wing's restricted. We'll take that as a non-compliance admission, Marla said, raising her voice just enough to carry. It worked. The staffer led them down a dim hallway, past locked steel doors, with reinforced glass windows. Most were empty, but one had its window covered from the inside. The nameplate said B. Jennings. Lorraine felt her knees weaken. She stepped forward, slowly, as Marla unlocked the panel with the universal override she'd pulled from state records. The door swung open with a cold hiss. Inside, the cell was barely wider than a walk-in closet. A thin mattress on a concrete ledge. A bucket in the corner. No lights on. And on the floor, curled against the wall, was Brian. His face was bruised, lips cracked, one eye swollen nearly shut. His clothes were too thin for the cold. When the light hit him, he flinched, shielding himself. Brian, Lorraine whispered, stepping inside. He didn't move. She crouched slowly, reaching into her coat pocket with trembling fingers. She had carried it with her for 17 years. Folded, washed, tucked inside drawers, and duffel bags, and corners of memory. A soft, faded baby blanket, with a stitched patch at the edge. Marcus's mother had sewn it before the birth. A simple pattern, stars and clouds, and the faint scent of time. She held it out. Brian stared at it, dazed, confused. Then something shifted. His swollen eyes narrowed. His breath caught. He looked at Lorraine, not as a stranger, not as a threat, but as something long buried trying to resurface. I know that, he rasped. That blanket. Lorraine nodded, her eyes burning. It was yours. I never let it go. He blinked, slow and deliberate. Why? Why are you here? I'm your mother, she said, steady. I came to take you home. He didn't cry. He didn't collapse. Instead, he just stared at her, like someone who didn't know if they were dreaming. She reached forward and touched his face gently, like snow landing on broken glass. He didn't pull away. Behind her, Marla spoke fast and low. We have to move. Now. Lorraine helped Brian to his feet. He winced, every motion laced with pain. But he walked, one arm around her shoulder, one hand clutching the baby blanket like a lifeline. They exited the cell quickly, but the hallway had changed. Lights flickered, an alarm buzzed low, then louder. Red lights lit the corridor. We've been flagged, Marla said. Security's coming from both sides. Is there another exit? Lorraine asked, heart pounding. Marla's eyes scanned the map etched in memory. Basement. Laundry chute. But we'll have to run. Brian stiffened. I can't, I'm too slow. No, Lorraine said, gripping his hand tighter. You've already survived the worst. You're walking out of here. They turned the corner and found 2 guards already blocking the hallway, radios crackling. Back up, one shouted. You're trespassing. Put him down. Marla pulled her badge. You're obstructing a court-ordered inspection. The guards didn't flinch. From behind, boots thundered. More coming. Marla's face hardened. They're surrounding us. Lorraine stepped in front of Brian, her body trembling but firm. Then we stand. Security raises the alarm. They're surrounded and can't escape. The first clip was only 37 seconds long. It wasn't polished, just shaky, grainy footage pulled from the body cam. Marla had hidden beneath her uniform. It started with a narrow hallway inside Southwell Academy, lit by flickering fluorescence, the air thick with tension. A locked door. Lorraine's voice calling softly, urgently into darkness. The creak of rusty hinges. A boy's weak voice responding. Then the camera caught Lorraine gently lifting Brian's bruised face and pulling out a small, tattered baby blanket. His eyes widened, and then came the chaos guards, shouting, red alarms flaring to life, and Lorraine's voice rising, unwavering. Then we stand. It ended there. But that was all the world needed to see. By midday, the video had gone viral. Over 2 million views in 6 hours. Hashtags surged through timelines like wildfire. Rescue Brian. Slate secrets. Maids know everything. Activists reposted it. Journalists dissected it. Celebrities endorsed it. Someone clipped Lorraine's voice. I'm your mother. I came to take you home, and looped it over protest footage and reels of Slate shaking hands with politicians. The internet had crowned its symbol, not because she asked for it, but because truth has a way of rising when the silence cracks. At first, Slate's media team tried to dismiss it. They released a short statement calling the video edited, claiming it was a manufactured incident meant to mislead the public. But then the survivors started coming forward. Boys who had once been locked inside facilities like Southwell, now men with eyes that carried too many memories. They gave interviews breaking down under the weight of their stories: solitary confinement, forced medication, silence beaten into them under the guise of discipline. Their faces were broadcast across primetime screens, and behind them Slate's foundations appeared in footnotes and funding logs. Then came the paper trail. Whistleblowers leaked internal documents, adoption files, funding agreements, court transcripts that painted a picture darker than anyone had expected. Private agencies receiving money from Slate's philanthropic arms, judges fast-tracking cases that rerouted Black children from their mothers to donors and political allies. One of those files held Lorraine's name, another, Brian's. The connection was irrefutable now. It wasn't just a bad decision, it was a system, and Slate's signature was everywhere. Suddenly, Lorraine was no longer being portrayed as a suspect. She was a truth-teller. The press flipped. News banners ran phrases like, "Domestic worker uncovers billionaire's adoption fraud," "Black mother's viral video sparks national inquiry." Aerial shots of Slate's mansion ran side by side with footage of protesters outside courthouses holding signs that read, "She was right. Believe Black mothers." How many Bryans? But Slate wasn't a man who stayed quiet. Within 48 hours, he struck back. His first move? A smear campaign. Medical records from Lorraine's hospital stay after the fire, documents that had been sealed years ago, somehow leaked. Conservative pundits used them to label her as emotionally unstable, accusing her of fabricating motherhood to seek attention. Headlines ran with words like obsession, delusion, and disturbed. A well-known anchor claimed, "This woman kidnapped children she had no legal claim over, and now the media wants to paint her as a hero." Expert commentators followed, casting doubt on Lorraine's mental health. Paid psychologists diagnosed her from afar, calling her a textbook case of maternal fixation rooted in unresolved trauma. Slate's PR machine worked overtime to repaint him as a misunderstood philanthropist, a man who had given his life to helping youth, now being dragged through the mud by a woman with a vendetta and a camera. Then Slate went public. He sat for an exclusive interview, dressed in a navy suit, flanked by a carefully arranged American flag. His expression was weary but dignified, the face of a man bearing a burden with grace. "I don't know why Miss Jefferson is doing this," he said calmly. "I barely know her. She was an employee. I feel deeply for her loss. But this campaign of personal destruction, it's not justice, it's pain. And I hope she finds healing." Marla muted the screen, her jaw clenched. "He's good," she said. "He's flipping the script, playing victim." Lorraine didn't flinch. "He's done this before. This is the same man who laughed at me in front of a room of donors. The same man who had my child locked away like a liability." But the public wasn't buying it this time. Protesters swarmed state buildings. Civil rights attorneys offered to represent Lorraine pro bono. Activist groups began circulating petitions calling for federal investigations into Slate's foundations. One nonprofit launched an awareness campaign showing faces of children who'd vanished from the adoption system, each one overlaid with the words "Who placed them?" And then came the image that changed everything. A protester printed a still from the viral clip. Lorraine in the hallway of the school, cradling Brian, holding up the baby blanket. They blew it up onto a 12-foot banner and hung it from the courthouse steps. No slogans, no hashtags, just a single sentence beneath it, stark and powerful. "Believe Black mothers." It was no longer just about Lorraine. She had become something larger. Proof that the system not only failed Black women, but actively erased them, then punished them for surviving. Slate's team saw the shift. They panicked. But then, as they always did, they pivoted. That Wednesday morning, as Lorraine and Marla sat reviewing court briefs in a tiny conference room, donated by a civil rights firm, Terrence burst through the door holding his phone up. "You need to see this," he said, eyes wide. They turned to the TV just as the live broadcast began. A news anchor with perfectly combed hair stared into the camera with manufactured urgency. "Breaking now," she said. Billionaire philanthropist and education reform advocate Gregory Slate has just announced his candidacy for United States Senate in the state of New York. The screen cut to a press conference. Slate stood behind a podium, flanked by donors, veterans, and the American flag. He wore that same composed expression, nodding solemnly as he addressed the crowd. "The time has come," he declared, "to take this fight to Washington. We cannot let lies and personal vendettas destroy decades of progress. I'm running for Senate to restore truth, to protect our children, and to lead with honor." The camera panned across the crowd. Applause. Chants of "Slate for Senate." As if none of it, none of the videos, none of the children, none of the truth had ever happened. Marla whispered, stunned. "If he wins, he's untouchable. Federal protection. Immunity. Control." Lorraine didn't speak right away. Then, slowly, she rose to her feet. Her voice was low, steady, unflinching. "Then we burn the whole stage. A bombshell drops. Slate is running for Senate." Slate's Senate campaign launched with precision, too polished, too fast to have been built in response. This wasn't a reaction. It was a strategy long in motion. The controversy around Southwell Academy, the viral footage, the wave of public sympathy for Lorraine, all of it became political currency overnight. Slate didn't run despite the scandal. He ran because of it. His narrative was simple. He was the victim of a coordinated smear. A man who had given everything to reform the system, only to be crucified by a mentally unstable former employee with a personal grudge. Within a week, his team began releasing a slow drip of Lorraine's past. Documents no one should have had access to. First came her hospital records from after the fire. They painted her as emotionally fragile, suffering from post-traumatic delusions. No context was offered. Just one damning phrase from an old social worker's assessment. "Patient struggles to separate grief from reality." That sentence, stripped of its humanity, became a headline. Then came the court files. Old ones, sealed long ago, now leaked. The paperwork showed Lorraine's agreement to surrender custody of her children. Signed under duress, but that detail was conveniently omitted. Slate's team repackaged the story. She abandoned them. They spun her pain into pathology, her sacrifice into betrayal. Pundits across political spectrums debated her credibility as if it were a game, some framing her as brave but broken, others as a manipulator preying on public emotion. Lorraine watched it unfold from the temporary apartment provided by a local advocacy group. The TV was muted, but the headlines scrolled mercilessly: "Billionaire or baby thief. The battle for the ballot. From maid to martyr. Is Lorraine Jefferson telling the truth?" She sat across from her children, now all under one roof for the first time in 17 years. But the air was thick, not with joy, but with tension. The media storm outside had found a way in. Jaden paced near the window, his frame tight with anger. "How the hell did they get those records?" he snapped. "Weren't they sealed?" "They were," Marla said flatly, arms crossed. "But Slate's reach doesn't stop at courtrooms. Somebody got paid." Renee sat hunched at the table, phone in her hand, eyes unreadable. "They're saying she signed us away. Just let us go." Lorraine didn't flinch. "I was 17. I didn't have a lawyer. No home. No family left. I signed papers under threat. They told me it was either that or lose you all separately. Forever." Noelle, quiet until now, spoke up from the corner. "But you did lose us. We grew up thinking we weren't wanted, that someone gave up." Her voice wasn't angry. It was hollow. That emptiness cut deeper than rage. Lorraine's eyes welled, but she held her posture. "They wanted you gone. I never did." The silence that followed wasn't forgiveness. It was understanding tangled in pain, and it lingered like smoke. But Slate wasn't done. 2 days later, Renee got a private message through Instagram. It looked harmless, an invite to speak at a student impact summit, hosted by one of Slate's nonprofit branches. Curious, she clicked. What she found was something else entirely: an encrypted email, an offer, and a number. She didn't tell anyone at first. She only told Noelle. "I think they want me to switch sides," Renee said in a whisper, sitting across from her sister in the small guest room. They said they'd fund my entire education. Debt-free, all I have to do is sign an NDA and stop speaking publicly. Noelle's eyes widened. You told Mom? Renee shook her head. Not yet. I wanted to think. Think about what? Noelle hissed. Renee, they locked Brian in a cell. You think they'll really give you college? Or will they just use your silence to clean their hands? Renee didn't respond. She just stared at the wall, the offer glowing like an escape. Later that night, at dinner things cracked. Jaden, already on edge, noticed Renee's distance. Her silence, her glances at her phone. The way she didn't join when Lorraine spoke about testifying in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. You hiding something? Jaden asked. Renee looked up sharply. What are you talking about?
You've been different.
Ever since that DM, Lorraine turned. What DM? Renee froze. And just like that, the trust Lorraine had been stitching together began to fray again. She stood up, calm but clear. Who contacted you? Renee hesitated. Then quietly, someone from Slate's campaign. They said I could have a future. A real one. Noelle jumped in. A future bought with silence. Renee's voice rose. You don't know what it's like to dream of college and only see closed doors. I worked my whole life for a scholarship I couldn't even apply for because I didn't have my birth records. Maybe I just want a chance. And you think he's the one to give it? Jaden barked. The room erupted. Voices overlapping, pain colliding. Lorraine tried to calm them, but it was too late. The wounds were too fresh, the truth too fractured, and the idea that Slate could now wedge himself between them, even after everything, was almost more unbearable than the silence before their reunion. Marla later warned Lorraine. He's not just attacking you, he's dividing the one thing he knows makes you dangerous. Your unity. Renee apologized the next morning. She said she never planned to accept the offer, that she was just curious, just tempted. But by then something had shifted, not spoken aloud, but felt. The seed of suspicion had been planted, and Slate was watering it. That afternoon, Lorraine went to pick up groceries, needing space to breathe. Apartment felt too small, too loud with unspoken thoughts. When she returned an hour later, she noticed immediately. Noelle wasn't home. Jaden assumed she was at the library. Renee thought she was with Terrence, but calls went unanswered. Messages unread. Her phone, it turned out, was left on her nightstand. By nightfall, panic bloomed. Noelle was gone. No note, no trace, no goodbye. Lorraine stood frozen in the doorway of the guest room, staring at the bed, still made, the pillow dented from the night before. She wouldn't just leave, she whispered. Marla's face went cold. Not unless someone made her. Her youngest daughter vanishes without warning. The courthouse stood like a cathedral of justice. Tall columns, broad steps, and an imposing facade that promised fairness even to those who had never felt it. Inside, the air was hushed and tense, as if the walls themselves were bracing for conflict. Federal Courtroom 4B was packed far beyond capacity. Journalists jockeyed for space, activists wore matching pins, and behind them ordinary citizens filed in with weary eyes that had learned too much trauma watching headlines turn into history. This was where Lorraine Jefferson's truth would either be vindicated or erased once and for all. Lorraine stood with her legal team just outside the courtroom before the doors opened. She wore a simple blazer, no flamboyance, no armor, only a quiet fire in her eyes that flickered between fear and fierce resolve. Marla stood beside her, with Terrence close behind, each offering silent support. Jaden, Renee, Noelle, and Brian fidgeted with mixed emotions. Hope, dread, anger, and a rigid determination born of years spent believing they were lost. When the judge called the court to order, there was a collective intake of breath. Cameras captured the moment live, broadcasting it across screens nationwide. Millions watched as Slate entered, surrounded by his top attorneys and PR advisors, his face set in that familiar mask of composed authority. He looked at Lorraine directly once, just once, his gaze sharp enough to cut glass. Lorraine took her seat at the plaintiff's table. Her attorney stood, voice steady, and began outlining the case. This trial is not merely about an alleged kidnapping. It is about a systemic abuse of power that targeted vulnerable families, disproportionately affecting Black mothers like Ms. Jefferson. We will show how private foundations, funded by Slate Holdings and its subsidiaries, manipulated adoption protocols, suppressed records, and exploited racial prejudices for profit and political gain. A murmur rippled through the audience. The defense countered swiftly, dismissing the claims as emotional narratives and unsubstantiated allegations. Slate himself sat impassive, lips thin, eyes unreadable. His name echoed in the room like a brand: wealth, influence, power, all cloaked in the language of philanthropy and reform. First to testify were former teens from Southwell Academy. One by one, they stepped forward, voices shaky, hands trembling, faces haunted by memories of padded rooms, unwarranted medication, and whispered threats. Each account was raw, unfiltered, and cutting. They described segregation by behavior, enforced isolation when they cried, and a culture of obedience that had been imposed like an invisible punishment for their identities. Some cried, some sat rigid, eyes distant as if half their spirit had been left in that facility. When the final teen concluded his testimony, the courtroom was silent long enough to hear the click of a shutter somewhere in the press box. Then it was time for Lorraine's children. Jaden stood first. His voice was steady as he recounted the confusion of growing up without understanding why they were separated, why no one fought for them, and why their identities were buried under paperwork that never made sense. His eyes flicked to Lorraine as he spoke, not with accusation, but with a longing that had haunted his adolescence. The cameras captured every moment, broadcasting his sincerity to millions who had never known separation, or the cost it carried. Renee followed, voice quaking but fierce. She spoke of birthdays with no mother, of foster homes that asked more questions than they offered answers, of a blank space where a family photo should have been. She said her name out loud, Renee Jefferson, as if defining it anchored her soul to truth. Noelle was next. Her testimony was quiet but piercing. She spoke of systemic prejudice baked into adoption protocols, of how her name changed, her identity reformatted, her history truncated before she could even learn to write it. Finally, Brian was called. He moved slower than the others, the bruise on his face now healed, but the shadow still lingering in his gaze. When he stood, the room held its breath. He cleared it once, then said, "I didn't know my mother until she showed me a blanket. It was old. It was soft. And for the first time, I understood love wasn't something that vanished. It was something stolen." The courtroom erupted, not in chaos but in palpable emotion. Women wept, men shifted in their seats, and outside the protests swelled with renewed fervor. The narrative had changed from theory to undeniable lived experience. Slate's attorneys grew pale, scribbling notes frantically, as the tide of truth washed over the room like a storm. But Slate was not finished with his final move. When the prosecution presented documents from Marla's archive, the sealed adoption files, the financial transfers tied to dummy foundations, and corroborating testimony from ex-staffers within Slate's network, the atmosphere felt like justice itself was taking a breath. The judge leaned forward, eyes scanning the stacks of inked paper that had once been hidden away, now brought into the glaring light. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, Slate's lead attorney rose. When Miss Jefferson's fiancé died, he began, voice calm, he left behind a will, a substantial estate entrusted to Miss Jefferson. However, a previously unpublished codicil has surfaced. The room stiffened. This document, signed just weeks before his death, designates Jefferson as unfit to raise children due to emotional instability stemming from her trauma. A gasp echoed from several rows. Lorraine's breath caught. Marla's hand flew to her mouth. Jaden's face tightened. The document was carried forward, laid gently on the bench in front of the judge. Its seal was authentic. The signature matched every known authenticated mark. It carried legal weight. Her legal team objected immediately, but the judge held up his hand, expression unreadable. "I will review this document," he said, voice measured. "Due to the nature of its potential impact, this trial is paused. Further evidence surrounding the authenticity of this will must be examined. Court is adjourned until further notice." The gavel struck. In that second, the courtroom erupted in confusion, disbelief, and panic. Reporters scrambled to their cameras, spectators whispered, some even cried. Lorraine stood frozen, staring at the document that seemed to weave betrayal into the very foundation of her case. Outside, the press corps exploded with urgent questions, tweets lighting up faster than any network could broadcast. Slate's attorney held up the codicil like a trophy, reciting its contents with clinical precision. The narrative shifted within hours. Headlines changed from "Mother exposes billionaire's crimes" to "New will throws federal trial into chaos." Legal experts weighed in across networks, some calling the document a bombshell, others urging caution about possible forgery. Lorraine felt like she had been punched from every direction at once. Her children gathered around her in the hallway, expressions a mixture of shock and despair. "What does that mean, Mom?" Renee asked. eyes brimming. "It means the court is no longer certain you had legal standing," her attorney said softly. "We have to prove the will is forged. That's our next battle." "But we just exposed everything," Jaden said, voice tight. "How does a piece of paper erase years of truth?" "It doesn't," Marla said, gripping his shoulder. "But it buys time, and time favors those with power." Lorraine felt the weight of the moment press into her chest like hands she couldn't push away. The courage of her children, the testimonies of survivors, the evidence they had painstakingly gathered, all paused by a single document that seemed to undo them. In the midst of the chaos, Marla's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then met Lorraine's eyes. "There's more," she said quietly. "Someone sent this to my encrypted line." The message contained a single phrase and a location. "Meet me where it began, Southwell. Bring proof of the codicil's forgery." Lorraine felt her pulse spike. "You think someone at Southwell knows something?" she asked. Marla didn't answer immediately. Then, slowly, "I think someone there was part of the network. And maybe they kept a copy." Lorraine swallowed hard. The trial had just taken its darkest turn yet. The judge halts the trial, citing new evidence that could destroy Lorraine's case. Southwell Academy looked even colder in daylight. Its walls, once ominous under alarms and sirens, now loomed in sharp gray stillness against the winter sky. Lorraine stood at its perimeter again, not as a rescuer this time, but as a woman clawing at the final roots of a lie so deep it threatened to swallow decades of her truth. Marla walked beside her, her jaw tight, hands stuffed into her coat pockets. Lorraine clutched a sealed envelope against her chest like it was sacred, because this time it was. Inside, buried in the past of this corrupt institution, was a document that Slate never wanted to see light. Saul Gentry, a former Southwell administrator who disappeared from public records years ago, had finally resurfaced. He reached out through an encrypted line, Marla used only for whistleblowers. His message was short, but electric. "I kept the original. I knew Slate was lying. I met in Southwell's boiler room, a forgotten space reeking of rust and old fear." Saul was frailer than they remembered from the leaked ID photo, his skin thin, voice cracked from disuse or regret. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. He handed over a folded envelope, yellowed at the edges, sealed with a wax stamp Lorraine hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. She knew that seal. Randall's seal. Inside was the original will. Dated, signed, notarized, and crystal clear. Randall Price, her late fiancé, had named Lorraine as the sole guardian of their children in the event of his death. He had left her everything: legal authority, financial protection, and his final words of trust. There was no mention of mental instability, no codicil, no exception. Randall's love and faith in Lorraine had been final. Slate's version, the one submitted to federal court, was a lie forged in legal ink and elitist ambition. Saul's voice shook as he explained how Slate's lawyers had submitted a forged will, an altered version of a property agreement Randall once signed, manipulating dates, typeface, and content. "I saw both," he whispered. "They didn't even get the paper right. I kept this one because I saw what he was doing. I couldn't stop it then, but you can now." Lorraine didn't cry. Her hands trembled. Yes, but not from sadness, from fire, from truth finally cracking through layers of suppression. Like light piercing the thickest fog, she looked up and nodded once. "This goes straight to court." A forensic document examiner confirmed it within 12 hours. Ink aging, stroke pressure, typewriter imprint, everything matched Randall's known documents. The forged codicil was a legal ghost, dead on arrival under scrutiny. Lorraine's team prepped the evidence, but she made one request: don't release anything to the press. I want this shown in front of the judge, in front of cameras when Slate can't run from it. 3 days later, the courtroom buzzed with energy, more intense than before. Every seat was filled: reporters, supporters, doubters, and those who just couldn't look away. Protesters outside chanted with renewed purpose, waving banners that read, "She was their mother all along. Expose every signature." Slate entered, flanked by his lawyers, his mask of calm cracking ever so slightly under the weight of headlines and truth closing in. He avoided looking at Lorraine this time. When the judge called for any final evidence, Lorraine's attorney stepped forward with the sealed envelope. "Your Honor," he said clearly, "we present the authentic original will of Randall Price. This document not only contradicts the alleged codicil presented earlier, it proves it was forged." The envelope was opened in the room, unfolded slowly under the eyes of the court. Then the forensic expert took the stand, walking the court through a clinical, brutal breakdown of the forgery, inconsistencies in spacing, printer technology not available at the time, mismatched seal placement, and ink composition indicating two different types were layered over time. The will submitted by the defense, the expert concluded, was created after Randall Price's death. This, he held up the real one, is the only legitimate legal document. Gasps rippled through the jury. A reporter dropped their pen. Someone in the back let out a quiet, "Oh my God." Laureen didn't blink. Her children stared ahead, wide-eyed. Brian leaned forward in his chair, mouth slightly open. Renee reached for Noelle's hand under the table. Jaden closed his eyes for a brief second, as if finally letting go of a weight he'd carried for 17 years. The judge turned to Slate's attorneys. "Would you like to respond?" Their lead counsel stood slowly, visibly rattled. "We request a brief recess to confirm this evidence." The judge nodded. 30 minutes. What happened next wasn't scripted. Slate didn't return. Cameras caught him slipping out the side entrance of the courthouse, ignoring reporters' shouts, pushing past his own security detail. Footage streamed live across every major network. Slate walking briskly down the courthouse steps, coat collar high, eyes darting. The moment he realized he was being filmed, he broke into a jog. That image, Gregory Slate, billionaire philanthropist, fleeing federal court like a thief in daylight, was instantly memeified, broadcast dissected. Within minutes, it was viral. Back inside the courtroom, the bailiff approached the judge with a note. He read it, eyebrows raised. "Gregory Slate," he announced, "has left the building. This court will proceed with final statements. A bench warrant for Mr. Slate's arrest is now issued." Laureen sat still, her chest rising and falling slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Her eyes remained fixed on the empty chair where Slate had sat moments ago, like a ghost finally vacated from the place it had haunted for too long. Outside, the protesters erupted. Chants shook the block. "Face the truth, Slate. Justice for Lorraine. Run, but you can't hide," Marla whispered. He thought the courtroom was his stage, but truth flipped the script. Laureen finally let herself speak. "No," she said quietly. "This was never his play. He just never realized the story wasn't about him." The judge called for final arguments, his voice louder than usual, commanding but colored with the weight of what had just happened. The media scrambled, phones buzzed, social feeds exploded, but Slate was gone, and the verdict would come without him. Slate flees the courtroom before the verdict. The snow that morning fell in delicate, unhurried waves, softening the sounds of the city and wrapping Harlem in a white stillness that felt almost sacred. But inside a modest brownstone tucked between two towering buildings, warmth pulsed through every wall. The scent of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and cornbread filled the air. There were no chandeliers, no marble floors, no crystal glasses, only laughter, shared silence, and a kind of peace that didn't have a price tag. Laureen Jefferson moved between the kitchen and the dining room with grace, her apron dusted in flour, her hair tucked beneath a red headscarf. The light in her eyes wasn't from the twinkling Christmas lights. It was from something deeper, earned the hard way. Around the table, her 4 children, Jaden, Renee, Noelle and Brian, were alive, present, and whole. Their voices overlapped in teasing and storytelling, the chaos of family harmony unfolding like a song that had waited 17 years to be sung. A year had passed since Slate's empire crumbled. The trial had ended not with a whisper, but a roar. Slate was now behind bars, convicted on over 30 counts including fraud, forgery, child endangerment, and civil rights violation. His name, once synonymous with power and philanthropy, had become a cautionary tale about arrogance and systemic exploitation. The public had turned, and for once justice hadn't come too late. Laureen had declined interviews, book deals, documentaries. She didn't want fame. She wanted repair, healing, wholeness. And in that year, some of that healing had taken root. Jaden was in school to become a public defender. Renee, who once doubted if she could trust again, had started volunteering at a youth center. Noelle had begun writing a memoir, a collection of memories, half-formed but stitched together with hope. Brian was in therapy, quietly rebuilding his sense of self. They still had questions, scars, nights when memories hit without warning. But they had each other now. They had a center again. They had a mother. "Cranberry sauce still tastes like regret," Renee announced, grimacing as she carried a small bowl to the table. Laughter erupted. Better than last year's sweet potato disaster, Brian replied, nudging her shoulder. Noelle raised a mock warning finger. Nobody insults my sweet potatoes. Jaden carved the turkey with slow care, grinning. Y'all better be grateful this isn't a catered dinner at some billionaire's mansion. We earned this. Lorene leaned against the doorway and watched them. Every movement, every smile was a miracle she refused to take for granted. She closed her eyes for a second, just to feel it all. The warmth, the noise, the love that filled every crevice. As the family sat, Noelle pulled something from her bag, a simple bound stack of paper. I have a gift, she said. It's a draft of the book I'm writing. Lorene looked surprised. A book? Noelle smiled. About us. About what they tried to erase. She passed it across the table. Lorene opened the first page. The title read, She Never Let Go. Renee leaned forward. You didn't, Mom. Even when you had no reason to believe we'd come back, you never let go. Tears shimmered in Lorene's eyes. She swallowed hard, nodding once. I didn't, she whispered. I couldn't. They sat like that, in the stillness of gratitude. No grand speeches, just presence, just peace. Then, a knock at the door. Everyone froze. Lorene wiped her hands and walked slowly to the front of the house. Snowflakes spiraled outside like they were carrying a message. She opened the door cautiously. A young woman stood on the stoop. She couldn't have been more than 20. Deep brown skin, high cheekbones, hair pulled into a tight bun. Her coat was worn but clean, and in her arms, bundled in a pale blue blanket, was a sleeping infant. I'm sorry, the young woman said quickly, eyes wide. I shouldn't have come like this. I didn't know where else to go. Lorene blinked. Do I know you? My name is Elia, she said. My mom. She was part of the same program, Southwell. They told her she had no family. She died 3 months ago, but before she passed, she told me she always wondered if someone had lied to her about where she came from. Elia swallowed hard. I found a file. It was hidden deep, under a fake ID. Her real name was Michaela Jefferson. She was your daughter. A twin. Lorene's mouth parted. The air left her lungs. They told you she didn't survive the fire, Elia said, voice shaking. But she did. They stole her too. She was raised in a different state, completely erased from your records. The baby stirred slightly. Elia looked down and then back up. I think I'm your granddaughter. Behind Lorene, the kitchen had gone completely silent. Jaden stepped forward. Renee covered her mouth. Brian's eyes widened. Lorene stepped out into the snow, her hands slowly reaching toward the child. You came all this way, she whispered. Elia nodded. Because I had to know. I had to see if the stories about you were true. Lorene smiled through her tears. Come inside, baby. Let's find out together. A knock at the door. It's a young woman, holding a child, claiming to be Lorene's granddaughter. If you believe no mother should ever be erased, not by money, not by power, and not by lies, type yes in the comments. Have you ever seen a family torn apart by a system pretending to protect them? Subscribe for more stories that uncover the truths too many try to silence. Because every voice deserves to be heard, and every injustice deserves to be exposed.